What if I told you that a quiet decision made far from Wall Street could ripple through your smartphone, your car, your investments, and even the balance of global power, not with missiles or tanks, but with a metal you probably last thought about as jewelry or spare change? Imagine waking up to headlines saying Russia has slammed the door on silver exports. And suddenly, US tech giants, renewable energy firms, and defense contractors are scrambling, prices are spiking, and markets are asking a dangerous question: was this planned as an economic weapon all along? This isn't science fiction, and it's not just about silver, it's about leverage, vulnerability, and how modern warfare is increasingly fought through supply chains instead of battlefields. To understand why a Russian ban on silver exports would matter so much, you first need to understand what silver really is in today's economy, because it's no longer just a precious metal sitting in vaults or hanging around someone's neck. Silver is one of the most conductive metals on Earth, which means electricity flows through it better than almost anything else, and that single property makes it critical to modern life. Every smartphone uses silver in its circuit boards. Every laptop relies on it for reliable connections. Electric vehicles use far more silver than traditional cars. Solar panels depend on it to convert sunlight into electricity. And advanced weapons systems, from radar to guided missiles, quietly rely on silver's performance under extreme conditions. In simple terms, if oil was the lifeblood of the 20th century, silver is one of the nerve endings of the 21st. Now let's bring Russia into the picture. Russia isn't the world's largest silver producer. That title belongs to Mexico, followed by countries like China and Peru, but Russia still sits comfortably in the top tier of global producers, mining tens of millions of ounces each year, much of it as a byproduct of its massive copper, gold, and zinc operations. What makes Russian silver particularly important isn't just volume, but reliability. For years, Russian silver has flowed into global markets with relatively predictable supply, often ending up in industrial applications rather than jewelry or investment bars. When sanctions hit Russia after geopolitical conflicts, oil and gas dominated the headlines, but metals quietly became part of the same chessboard. So what happens if Moscow decides to ban silver exports, either fully or selectively? First, supply tightens overnight. The global silver market is not as deep or flexible as people assume. Annual global demand for silver has consistently exceeded mine supply in recent years, creating structural deficits that have been papered over by recycling and inventory drawdowns. According to industry data, global silver demand has hovered around 1.2 billion ounces per year, while mine production struggles to keep up, often falling short by tens of millions of ounces. That gap matters, because it means the market has very little slack. Remove a major exporter, even one that contributes 5 or 6% of global supply, and prices don't just inch higher, they can leap. For us tech companies, this is where the pain begins. Unlike gold, which can be substituted or used primarily for investment and reserves, silver in electronics is often irreplaceable or extremely difficult to substitute without sacrificing performance or increasing costs. Yes, engineers can try to use copper or aluminum in some applications, but those metals don't conduct electricity as efficiently and often require more material, more space, and more energy, which is the opposite of what modern miniaturized electronics demand. Imagine trying to shrink a smartphone while using inferior conductive materials. It's like trying to build a race car but being told you can't use high-octane fuel. Financial markets would react almost instantly. Silver prices, which already have a reputation for volatility, would likely surge as traders price in future shortages. Industrial buyers would rush to secure long-term contracts, investors would pile into silver ETFs and physical bullion, and futures markets would reflect growing fear of supply disruptions. Historically, silver has a dual personality, part precious metal, part industrial commodity, and that makes its price behavior unique. During times of economic stress, it can act like gold, a store of value, but during periods of industrial expansion or supply shocks, it can behave more like oil or copper. A Russian export ban would hit both sides of that equation at once. But here's where the story gets more strategic and more unsettling. Russia has watched for decades as the US used financial tools as weapons, sanctions, payment system restrictions, and trade controls. In response, Moscow has openly discussed the idea of asymmetric economic warfare, using areas where the West is vulnerable, rather than trying to match military or financial power head-on. Silver fits perfectly into this doctrine. It's critical, it's underestimated, and it's deeply embedded in technologies that the US considers essential for both economic growth and national security. Cutting off silver isn't about crashing markets overnight, it's about slowly increasing costs, creating bottlenecks, and forcing difficult choices inside boardrooms and government offices. Think about renewable energy for a moment. The the US has poured billions into solar power as part of its energy transition, and silver is a key input in photovoltaic cells. Each solar panel uses a small amount of silver, but when you multiply that by millions of panels, the numbers become enormous. A sustained increase in silver prices or a shortage of supply could quietly slow down solar deployment, raise project costs, and undermine climate goals, all without a single press conference or missile launch. The same logic applies to electric vehicles, where silver demand is expected to rise sharply over the next decade as EV adoption accelerates. From a historical perspective, this wouldn't be the first time a resource was weaponized. In the 1970s, oil embargoes reshaped global politics and economies, teaching nations a harsh lesson about dependence. Japan's experience with rare earth export restrictions from China in the 2010s offered a more recent example of how targeted resource controls can cause panic and force rapid policy changes. Silver, however, sits at an interesting intersection. It's not as obviously strategic as oil or rare earths, but it's arguable. Why more deeply embedded in everyday technology? That makes it a subtle weapon, one that works quietly, persistently, and with plausible deniability. For investors watching this unfold, the implications are complex. On one hand, higher silver prices could benefit mining companies, particularly those outside Russia, as well as investors holding physical silver or silver-backed instruments. On the other hand, increased costs for manufacturers could weigh on tech stocks, renewable energy firms, and any sector that relies heavily on advanced electronics. This creates a push and pull in markets, where gains in one area are offset by pain in another, and volatility becomes the norm rather than the exception. The US government wouldn't sit idle, of course. Strategic stockpiles, recycling incentives, trade agreements with alternative suppliers, and even accelerated research into silver substitutes would likely come into play. But these solutions take time, and time is exactly what markets don't like when supply chains are disrupted. In the short term, uncertainty reigns, and uncertainty is the fuel of price swings. So when people ask whether banning silver exports could really kill us tech, the honest answer is no, not overnight, but it doesn't have to. Economic weapons rarely aim for instant collapse. They aim for pressure, for friction, for forcing your opponent to spend more money, accept lower margins, or slow down innovation. Silver, in this context, becomes less a metal and more a message, a reminder that in a globally connected world, even something as small as a few grams of conductive material can carry enormous strategic weight, and that realization is only just beginning to sink in for policymakers, investors, and consumers alike as the world edges closer to a new kind of resource-driven standoff. And that brings us to the question of what happens next, and how prepared the US really is now.